here. So what I want to do today is to just tell you some few aspects of how you might think about a very quickly changing area that's been quickly changing since really electricity became commercialized not much more than 100 years ago. So I want to do three things. First is to give you some background on electric power trends and why they're changing. Second is to tell you some of the work that we are doing and have done on renewable electricity, which is a big deal in certain areas of the planet. And then very briefly touch on something that may be a transformational change, electric power storage. Okay? So first, some background and why things might change. So I want to just show you what the consumption of electric power has been since 1990 over the 20-year period there. And the orange line is what's happened, and the dotted line is a simple exponential fit. And that says you have to build a whole new electric power system every 23 years. Right? And there's some indication at the right end of that curve that it actually may be accelerating. The little dip was caused by the recession, of course. And so what are the pressures for changes in the electric power system and why things may be different and why they may be the same? Well, first, population is changing. I'll talk to you about that. Second, the number of electrons per person used is changing. Third, there are shifts in the fuels. And fourth, there is concern over greenhouse gas emission. I'll talk briefly about all of those. This is a semi-log plot of world population. The various colored projections are by the United Nations. This is what they think is their high case. This is their low case. I don't know what they think might happen here, another bubonic plague. And this is their medium case. The uncertainties show you that they don't know really very much. But the fact is that it's been going up very fast indeed. And that's not the end of the story. The use per person, per capita use, has been going up. And this is a period from 1970 to 2010. Over this 40 years, it's gone up from about 1,200 kilowatt hours per year to about double that, almost triple that, right? Two and a half times that. So let's look at that in some detail. The top curve is the United States, and there's some indication that that's been flattening out, largely because of the deindustrialization, or at least the deindustrialization of any growth in the United States. The EU is still going up a bit more. Again, this is the recession world you've just seen, and this is China and India. And of course, we always talk about China and India as one word. Those are two very different curves. Okay. Oh, by the way, here's Qatar. Okay. Uses about 30% more electric power than the United States per person. Okay. And here are the digital data. Only Iceland, Norway, and Finland use more electricity per capita than Qatar. Right. So there we are. Important here, yes, and it's growing. The darker areas in this map are where the use of electric power is growing the fastest. This is in percent per year. And all of these dark areas are more than 6% per year growth. Right? That's a doubling time of about a decade. Very strong infrastructure effects. All right, so now let me talk about the shifts in fuels. This is a graph that shows very little shifts over a period from 40 years about. Coal, gas, and oil together, it's going up. Nuclear is going up a bit. Hydro is going up. Non-hydro renewables have gone up quite a bit. And of course, in the press, that's what gets a lot of the ink or electrons these days. But when you break this down and you look at the details, it looks very different, and there are big shifts. This is a pie chart showing the ends of that last curve. And first, the pie has gotten a lot bigger, from 6 to 20 terawatt hours a year. Second, the market share has changed remarkably. Oil is down by a factor of 5. Gas has doubled, and nuclear has quadrupled. And oil is used now basically in two areas. In the island nations and in nations that don't have much gas. And we're sitting in the midst of a region where there's a lot of oil, and some countries don't have a lot of gas, right? And they're forced to use oil for that. Now, let me focus down from the world to the U.S., not because I think it's the most important, but because that's where I have the most data. Right? And so I want to show you some big shifts that are mirrored in certain areas of the world on what generation has been built. These are two graphs. This is the current U.S. capacity, not the generation. Natural gas has beat out coal. And that was largely because, here's a time series of the same thing, of a huge spike in building natural gas generation about a decade ago. This green spike is wind, right? And here is nuclear. We had a big build out of nuclear. And coal was more steady build out. We're actually building some more coal at the moment. This huge spike was caused by a confluence of factors. First, the restructuring of electric power in the United States from a very highly regulated to a not so highly regulated area, at least in about half of the states. And people said, oh boy, we want to get rich. We can build these power plants quickly. And oh, by the way, here's the second effect. The forecast was that natural gas prices would stay low forever. You look at the data from the Energy Information Administration, whose research director is our old colleague, Howard Grunspecht, and the agency said it was going to stay at $2 forever. Well, it is just about $2 now in the U.S., but it didn't stay that way forever. This is a chart of the build-out, and again, natural gas build-out a decade ago was just enormous in the United States, dwarfed anything else that ever happened. And guess what? That's what's happening right now in the United States. Again, natural gas prices are very low. In Japan, natural gas is selling for about $16 a thousand cubic feet. In Europe, round numbers, it's about 8. In the U.S., it's about 3. And this is the percentage of electric power that was generated by natural gas starting in about 1975, and it went down. We actually forbid the use of natural gas for electric power generation for a while in the United States, new power. And then it crept up till it just about doubled from 9% or more than doubled to about 25% of power. Well, that had a little effect on price. There is this half-baked theory about supply and demand that you may have heard about, right? And so here's the price on the left-hand scale. This is the annual average natural gas price. And it's $2, and everybody built the gas, remember, about a decade ago, and it remained $2, and the gas crept up. And then it started hitting the supply limits, and gas prices spiked to 4 times their previous levels. And that also, of course, encouraged development. And so we now have shale gas, and fracturing the shale has led to an oversupply of gas in the U.S. and driven the prices back down. And there are people who think it's going to stay that way forever, right? And I say to them, the surest route to $8 gas is for all of you to plan for $3 gas. Right? And that's what's happening. Everybody is building natural gas facilities because gas, you can get a long-term contract now at $3, $3.50, $4 okay, in the U.S. All right, so now let me talk about the fourth main driver, greenhouse gas emissions concerns. If you follow the European Union, you know that they're serious in some ways about greenhouse gases. If you follow the U.S., not so much. But there are indications that even in the U.S., we may get serious about greenhouse gases. You know, it was about 15 years between the failure of the last big initiative in the U.S. for healthcare reform until the passage of healthcare reform in the current administration. So it may be that in another 15 years we will get greenhouse gas regulation in the U.S. That's short compared to the lifetime of power plant investments. So why are people interested in greenhouse gas and electricity? This is the share of U.S. CO2 emissions that are due to electric power. Went up from about 12% when I was born to a little over 40% now. Okay? And at the same, and that's because electricity is a desired fuel. It's easy to transform. We can do a lot with it. People like electricity as opposed to having coal heat in their house, for example, which we used to have. And the power sector in the United States has not done a great job in decarbonizing, in increasing the efficiency. It's gone down again the same time scale from 1950 to now by, it's kind of a third less emissions during that time. Of course, natural gas has less emissions than coal by more or less a third less when you count in all the extraction phase. But it's not zero. Okay? And demand in the U.S. is increasing. Like the world, it was increasing exponentially. This was about 8% per year until the oil price shocks of the early 1970s, and now it's been linear. That's a profound change. In the United States, if it had kept increasing exponentially, well, the ceiling isn't high enough. But it did transition to linear. It is still growing linearly. The industrial demand is not growing, but the commercial and residential demand is driving the use up. Okay? And when you extrapolate these numbers, it says about half again as big a power sector by 2030 as we have now. Okay? That's only in 20 years. That's pretty substantial, even for linear growth. So that's a big driver of electric power changes. So this is the baseline from which we're changing. At the moment in the U.S., it's about 45% coal, about a quarter natural gas, about 20% nuclear, and the rest is all small stuff. Okay. A little bit of oil. Puerto Rico and Hawaii, mostly. Okay. And the biggest renewable hydroelectric power. So at CMU Pittsburgh, we've spent a fair amount of work on low-carbon electric power generation. One aspect of our work on that is renewables. But first, let me talk to you about the difference between low-carbon and renewables. This is all of electric power generation in the U.S. The blue is fossil, the orange is nuclear, and the green is renewables, largely hydroelectric power. Right? And 30% of our electricity is generated by low-carbon sources. To look at that another way, the green here is renewable, and the orange is total low-carbon. Okay, and the difference is the nuclear power. So the share, the market share, if you will, of renewables has decreased substantially in my lifetime because demand increase has diluted the hydroelectric power share of the market. Okay? And it's been brought back only by the addition of nuclear power. And you can see even all of the press that renewables are getting and so forth in the U.S., the market share has gone up a little bit, just a little bit, right? Okay, so again, this is what renewables have been looking like, but it gets a lot of attention. A lot of the build-out of electric power is renewables. And so we'll talk about that. And this is what the renewable pie chart looks like. Largely hydro, wind is second, and these are the percentages of the total. Wood, well, we don't think much about wood, but the pulp and paper industry generates a great deal of electric power from the black liquor which is used to make pulp and paper. They use that all on site. So this is where the wind farms are in the United States. This is a chart I did a week or so before I left for Doha. And the wind farms are generally concentrated in a big belt in the center of the U.S., some in California. But this is a very windy area in the U.S. And the electric power production of wind fuel has gone up exponentially, very steeply, in response to both federal subsidies and state mandates, what are called in Britain renewables obligations, going up that way. So a fair amount of land has been devoted to this. This is what good land use looks like. It's pretty benign. The farmer gets between $3,000 and $5,000 a year for renting out his land to the wind turbine. The farmer likes that, right? Or the land use can be not so benign. This is somebody who thought if a little weed killer was good, a lot must be a lot better. And this happens to be in the view of a fairly high-end residential development for vacationers there. They don't like it at all. They don't like looking at it, what they consider to be an industrial landscape. There are large land use issues with wind. And if wind is going to be at large scale, in the research that we've done, it's not going to be the electrical engineering that stops it. and I'll show you some of the reasons why. It's going to be the land use issues, because you're going to need to stop all of the wind over an area the size of New York State in order to meet a third of the U.S. power needs by wind. And that's probably just not going to be acceptable to folks in the end. All right, whoops, hit the wrong button. So this is somebody at Boston University who has looked at the land use, and this is in acres per megawatt hour, counting the mining for nuclear, coal, and the surface stuff for natural gas, photovoltaic, wind, hydroelectric. This is the dam side. Biomass is ridiculous. Okay, I would need essentially all of my half of Pennsylvania to power one power plant from biomass. Okay? Just not going to happen. So let me show you some of the other issues with land use. This is a wind turbine in the Netherlands having a failure. Right? What happened was both brakes on it. You want to see that again? Both brakes failed. There's a redundant system. This stuff happens in any industry. And no fatalities, but it was a close thing. These guys had been up there who had shot the video fixing the first brake when the second one failed, and they got out of there pretty quickly and shot this video. All right, and again, from a land use standpoint, what's a wind farm going to look like 20 years after you put it up? States are starting to realize that you're going to need some decommissioning rules to make sure that people who have bought and sold these wind farms are around to take them down at the end of their life. Again, land use. Now, let me get into the electrical pieces of this. Wind is not steady. Right? Anybody who's been outside knows that. And so this is a graph of all the wind production in the whole state of Texas. They have about 10 gigawatts, 10,000 megawatts of wind power every hour last year. It's up and down and up and down, even aggregated over the entire state of Texas. Not something that you'd like to feed directly into your light bulb. Okay? You've got to have some other generation to compensate for this variability. And so one of the things we started doing when we got into renewable power at CMU Pittsburgh was look at what the character of those fluctuations are from a mathematical standpoint. Well, the first thing we did was to say, well, when does wind produce power compared to when people need power? Well, this is a curve, again, in Texas, of when people are using power. This is every hour of the day, midnight, 6 a.m., noon. And in Texas and most other places, the use of power peaks around dinner time, around 6 p.m. or so. And it's lowest just before dawn. And there's about sort of 50% change here. This is when the wind blows. Onshore wind blows mostly at night. We don't have good data for offshore wind. Not a great match. But you can fill in a fair amount of power if nothing else is running. How about seasonally? Again, this is Texas. This is last year. This is every month of the year. And I've scaled these so they're about the same. This is the demand for power in Texas. It's biggest in the summer when they use air conditioning. The wind is biggest in the spring, and it falls off during the air conditioning demand. Okay? And the wind comes back in the fall and the winter where there's fairly low air conditioning demand. So at 100% wind, can you meet demand? Okay, you'd have to have a great deal of various electric power storage. Can it make a substantial contribution, 20 or 30%? Sure, it can do that, no problem. All right, let me show you another issue with wind. This is in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. For people who know the United States, it's in Oregon and Washington. And the wind there, 1,000 wind turbines, failed completely for nearly 2 weeks in January of a couple of years ago. Okay, zero wind production, a big high pressure area, sat over the whole region, and it just wasn't windy at all. So when you're looking at these kind of data, you have to say, not only do I have to fill in these fast fluctuations, but I have to fill in the times when the wind isn't blowing at all. So if I build 1,000 megawatts of wind, I'm probably going to have to build 1,000 megawatts of something else to back it up on weeks like this. So we started looking also at the fast time fluctuations of this. This is what it looks like with 10-second resolution data. This is about 2 weeks worth of data. And we were able to tease out some interesting character of that has big effects on the cost of the electric power system when you're putting in a lot of wind. So we asked, what's the character of those fluctuations? How many of you have a music device, like an iPad or a iThing of one sort or another? Yeah, okay. All of those devices have an equalizer on it, right? You can boost the low frequencies or the high frequencies. So what I'm going to show you is a graph of how much power, how much amplitude that wind data I just showed you has at the low notes and the high notes. Okay? If I played it through a speaker, which I could do for you, it would have certain low notes, bass notes, and high notes, treble notes. Okay? So I'm going to show a graph of that to you. And what we see is that in the bass notes, there's much more power, 100 times more power than there is at the kind of treble notes of a minute or so. There's also a remarkable linear character over 4 orders of magnitude of these data. There's some other interesting stuff in there as well. And over those 4 orders of magnitude, this falls off as the frequency to the minus 5/3. It's an interesting result. In the 1940s, a Russian mathematician by the name of Kolmogorov had imagined, just on theoretical grounds, that it would look just like this for turbulent eddies in the atmosphere and in the water. It wasn't confirmed for almost 20 years, or a little more than 20 years, and it wasn't observed in the atmosphere for another 10 years. Okay? We found it in the output of wind turbines. It's not white noise. You've all heard the term white noise. That means at any frequency, it has the same loudness. Okay? This doesn't do that, and there's an enormously important piece to that. It means that if you're going to buffer wind power, most of the things that you need to do it can ramp up and down quite slowly, like a natural gas plant or even a coal plant. You don't need a big lot of batteries or other things that can ramp very quickly. You need a bit of that, but not so much. If this had been white noise, if the character of this had been flat at all frequencies, you would need a tremendous amount of very expensive power sources that you don't use often to do that. In fact, it's going to be a lot cheaper than people thought even 3 years ago to integrate wind, because you don't need those very fast moving sources. So that's a good news. All right, so there's some things that we can learn from the power spectrum about the smoothing of wind. We looked at all the wind plants in Texas, okay, these 20, and here's the power spectrum I just showed you. Again, the low notes have a lot more power than the high notes, but now I'm going to have you look at the slope of this. That's with one wind plant, 4 of them connected together, and all 20 of the ones that we looked at connected together. And what we find is that as you connect more and more plants together, there is less power at the high frequencies, but it's about the same at the low frequencies. What that means is the people who have said you need to build transmission lines to connect all the wind farms in Europe together so that the power will get smooth are wrong. What you really need is just some way to buffer the high frequencies, and it doesn't really do you much good to connect them together, because all you're doing is buffering, is smoothing out the very highest frequencies in this, the fastest fluctuations. And you don't need to do much of that, because there's 1,000 times less power in those than there is in the frequencies that you can counteract with a coal or a natural gas plant. Very important result economically. Okay, so I've told you about those two things. The other thing is that when you talk about the smoothing that you can get from adding wind plants together, the time scale is very important. Same's true for solar, by the way. And that the smoothing at 12 hours is a lot less, say, at 24 hours certainly, than it is at a minute or 1 hour. Okay. And again, the other thing that we found, because we're in a business school, is where the point of diminishing returns is for this. How many wind plants should you connect together before you stop building transmission to do it? Turns out the answer is about a half a dozen, maybe 4. Even at 1 hour, where you smooth out about 95% of the fluctuations, when you connect about 4 plants together, you've reached the point of diminishing returns. You're done. You shouldn't spend money on transmission to connect a lot of them together. And certainly at 12 hours, you're only smoothing about a third of the fluctuations, half the fluctuations maybe. And again, you're done after a half a dozen plants. So the people who have written articles, even made the cover of Scientific American that said, oh, just cover the country with transmission lines and you'll be all right, they were overstating the case for transmission lines. Okay. Well, we published this and we were criticized by people saying, well, Texas is a small area. Maybe the wind there is very different from the U.S. So we looked at all of the windy areas in these 4 colored regions there, and they're the wind plants, and we connected them all together, and the answer is just the same. You don't get any additional smoothing by connecting very large regions together. I won't bore you with the pictures with that. I'll just show them quickly. These are the power spectra of those 4 areas, and when you look at the slopes of those lines, and you say, well, more smoothing is a faster slope. Some of these regions have more smoothing than others, but when you add them all together, not much. So again, you shouldn't be building tremendous transmission lines to connect wind, or as it turns out, solar power together to smooth out the fluctuations. So we asked, what's the cost of the variability? And the answer is about a ½ cent to 1 cent per kilowatt hour. Okay? Power in the U.S. wholesales for about 5 cents a kilowatt hour. For wind, it's about 7 cents. So it's a not negligible fraction, a half a penny or 1 cent per kilowatt hour for the fillet. Now let me talk to you about some other variability. Hydroelectric power in the U.S., we ramped up, exponential growth, remember, but then you can see after that these big dips. Well, we get about 1 big drought and 1 small drought every 10 years. In the U.S., and we see the same thing when we look elsewhere in the world. That's the kind of natural variability of the climate system. And so we asked the question, are you going to see that same kind of variability for wind? And so we looked at airport data. We don't have wind data going back 40 years, but we have airport wind station data. And so we scaled that, and this was the hydroelectric data I showed you for the last 40 years. And here's the wind data. And it looks variable, but it looks like it has kind of half the variability that the hydroelectric power does. So we think there are going to be windy years and not so windy years, but by maybe half of the variability that you see in hydroelectric power. And we see that in real systems, not just this toy system that we put together from the airport data. This is 4 years of data from Texas, and again, that normalized, we call it capacity factor, has gone down and then gone back up again. And we are seeing this kind of variability in real power systems with wind. All right, so now let's talk about photovoltaic, much more relevant here than wind most likely. And these are the operating large, above 5 megawatt systems in the United States. And so, solar is abundant. There's thousands of times more solar energy falls on the planet than we're using at the moment, even at very low efficiency that's readily available at the moment. Solar cells would cover only about 0.5% of the land area in the U.S., which is a lot less than we do for crops. Okay? But they don't produce power very often. A nuclear plant will produce power about 90% of the time. A solar plant, even in the desert in the U.S., produces power about 20% of the time. Well, you know it can't produce more than half the time because it's night half the time. And it turns out clouds, even in the desert, are significant. On a day like today, here, you wouldn't get a lot of energy out of the solar panels. Okay? The problem is cost. The unsubsidized cost is at least a factor of 3 more than any other low-carbon power, and a factor of 5 more than the cost of power from dirty sources that we're seeing at the moment. And the price hasn't been decreasing all that much in the last few years. And the solar cells, heck, I could give you the solar cells for free. And the balance of the system costs, inverters, the charge controllers, and so forth, would still cost you about 1.5 times what other low-carbon power sources cost you. But let's take a look at the character of that. This was a postdoc in our lab, and she and I took a look at some data from what was then the largest solar plant in the United States in the desert in Arizona, eastern Arizona. This is what it looks like. And so here is a day something, maybe it was me. Here's a day that had no clouds, and it looks nice. The sun rises, it gets to be noon, and it sets. This is the very next day. What happened? Clouds, yeah. You'll notice that even in their publicity picture, there's clouds, right? Okay, so here's some high-resolution data. This is 1-minute data, and here is 10-second data. Okay? This is not something you want to hook up to your light bulb or your refrigerator or your air conditioner, okay, without buffering it like this. This is, you know, clouds, high, thin clouds, or puffy cumulus clouds will get in the way. And when you look again at the power spectrum of that, it turns out it's even worse at high frequencies than wind is. So it's going to be substantially harder to worry about the high frequency fluctuations for solar than for wind. Well, what about solar thermal, where instead of running it onto photovoltaics, you run it into a tube of oil and run the oil into a heat exchanger and then run it into a turbine? That ought to have a lot more inertia because the oil has more thermal inertia, right? And in fact, it does. We just have some data. This is wind in the red. This is solar photovoltaic. And this is solar thermal. And it is quite a bit less, maybe a factor of 30 less less variable at the high frequencies than solar photovoltaic, and actually quite a bit less variable than wind. So if the costs ever come down, they're actually going up now for solar thermal because they're having trouble with the coatings and so forth. If the costs ever come down, solar thermal will be much less expensive to integrate into the power system than solar photovoltaic. Okay? And these are the digital data on the costs. This is wind, this is solar thermal, and this is solar voltaic from a couple of different places. And again, it's about, this is dollars per megawatt hour divided by 10 to get cents per kilowatt hour, about 1 penny per kilowatt hour here, and a half a penny per kilowatt hour for either the solar thermal or the wind farm. Okay, good thing to do. Now, let me talk about something that's important in the United States and Europe, and in some of the Far East, and that's emissions, specifically nitrous oxides and carbon dioxide emissions from the plants that do have to ramp up and down to follow the wind or the solar. So we had some real data from actual gas turbines that were ramping up and down, and we played that in the computer into a system that had wind. We had wind or solar data. And here's the interesting piece. If you look at the fairly prevalent GE large gas turbines, they are optimized. This is the nitrous oxide emitted in pounds per minute. They're optimized for high power steady state operations. This is real data that we collected. And at low power, they have some horrendously awful emissions because the engineers designed them for a point design at high power. Okay, that's fine. Well, those are the types of turbines that are out there. And if you take a look at the data that I'm going to show you, what we're going to see is as I add more and more wind or solar to the system, that's what we call penetration, you would assume that I displace more and more emissions, right? If I put in 30% wind, I ought to get 30% less nitrous oxide emissions, 30% less CO2 emissions. Well, I don't. This is the expected 30% less at 30% penetration, and this is predicted from our model. Well, this is CO2. You have to keep these gas turbines running. They idle, and when you ramp them up and down, their gas mileage is horrible, right? When I was learning how to drive when I was 16, my gas mileage was horrible because I'd stomp on the accelerator and stomp on the brake, right? The same's true for these things. The nitrous oxide emissions are much worse. When you get past about 10 or 15% penetration, the nitrous oxide emissions actually go up by a factor of 3 or 4 above if you didn't have any wind at all. And that's because these types of turbines, actually all types of turbines that are out there now, have a plan that is set up for just high power, steady state operations. And so we showed these data to GE and Siemens and Mitsubishi, and GE picked right up on it. That was 4 years ago. And their new flex gas turbines have eliminated this problem. Okay? And that's partly because they're a very data-driven company. So let me summarize on renewables. Smart integration is going to use a portfolio of fill-in power. A lot of that will require fairly slow ramp rates, gas or even coal, and some with high ramp rates. Secondly, the amount of smoothing is very dependent on the time scales, and it doesn't really help to interconnect very large areas. There are likely to be years of good wind, like rainy years, and not such good wind. And then finally, solar thermal is probably preferable to solar photovoltaic if the costs ever come down. Well, the costs for both of them are ridiculous at the moment. But if the costs ever come down for either of them, PV is not as preferred as solar thermal. Okay, so that's renewables. Now, there's been a lot of talk about batteries in the electric power system making everything easier, right? Could mean that since we can generate power fairly cheaply at night, we store power in batteries at night and use it during the day when the air conditioning's on, among other things. Well, electricity can be stored at large scale. We do it now in hydroelectric power storage, and about 2% of all the power in the United States, where I have some data, and a little less than that in the world, where the data is not quite so good, is stored in this way. You pump power uphill at night, you let it run down during the day. We've been doing that for 80 years. We also have newer large-scale batteries. And there's actually a Carnegie Mellon University spin-off that is one of the most promising technologies for doing that, a company called Aquion. And some people think that plug-in electric cars or plug-in hybrid electric cars may be usable for grid storage. So we ask the question, what might change if that happens? Well, renewable integration is certainly one of them, but the problem is the cost. And we're looking, again, pumped hydroelectric storage is pretty cheap. But the problem is you can't do it every place. You need a river, you need a lake, you need 1,000 feet between them. Okay? Lithium-ion batteries like the one in my laptop are really expensive, or the one in the Chevy Volt or the Nissan Leaf car. Sodium-sulfur batteries are pretty expensive. Aqueous ion batteries like the ones that CMU's spin-off is doing look like they might be down to almost what hydroelectric storage is, and of course you can put those anywhere. So it may happen, and we may see in our lifetimes a revolution of battery storage. Well, what could that do to electric power? Is that the next big thing in power? One of the things is, I won't get into too many details here, but it can buffer a lot of the wind, right? We saw that you don't need a battery to buffer the low or the high frequencies because there's just not much high frequency. But you can use it. Instead of ramping a coal plant up and down, you could store the energy in the battery. You could shift it from night, when the wind blows strongly, to the day. You could use a battery for that. And you don't need much batteries to knock off the highest and the lowest valleys of that sharp wind time profile that I showed you in Texas, the green one there. You just need a little bit of batteries, and it might not cost all that much. Well, the other thing that might change, besides renewable integration, is what we call frequency regulation, keeping the frequency at 50 hertz or 60 in the USA. You got both in Japan, which is part of the problems there. And those things happen because if you have a big demand for electric power, it tends to draw the frequency down. And that tends to burn out your motors, which is not good. And we can use batteries to fix that. We can also, as I was mentioning, fill in the load profile here so we could run plants constantly, which is very efficient, charge the batteries at night and dump them during the day. The other thing that I think is a really interesting opportunity from a business standpoint is that the current markets for electric power, where we do have markets, Western Europe and about 20 states of the 50 states in the US, is that the electric power markets are set up in a very funny fashion. Unlike shoes, there's no inventory. You can't store electric power. And so the markets are set up in auctions where essentially everybody has market power. If I'm a generator, even a small one, I can blackmail the market by withholding my power because there's going to be a blackout. If I have a battery in my system, I'm not going to be susceptible to that blackmail anymore. That's going to be disruptive, and that's probably the largest thing that batteries are going to do. So if I'm going to summarize by answering the question of what's next in electric power, first, gas. No question. There's going to be a lot more gas, and we're going to reduce the coal use and get more gas. Secondly, I think that there is going to be a continued emphasis on renewables in certain areas, because until the renewable portfolio standards start to increase the cost of power by a great deal, and that's true only when they mandate solar. If they let any renewable compete, it'll increase power, but cost by only about 20%. We're going to see a build out of wind and, to a certain extent, small hydroelectric power. Third, we're going to see continued emphasis on other low-carbon electric power than renewables. That is going to be nuclear. It's going to possibly be capturing the CO2 from natural gas and coal plants, although that still looks, despite 2 decades of intensive laboratory work, to be too expensive for commercial deployment. And we might very well see a wild card, batteries coming in to disrupt the system. So it's going to be a very exciting time. And for those of you who are students, how many students do we have? Okay, great. This is going to be a really exciting time for you to go out and make money, right? And make a lot of money so that you can give it to CMU, right? Okay, but it's going to be a tremendously exciting time for you. I think that the changes that are going to happen in your careers are going to be fabulous. They're going to be certainly bigger than the changes that happened in my lifetime in electric power, and those were pretty substantial. So have fun with it, and thank you very much. I'd be happy to answer any questions. And if not, I'll start asking some. Aha, there's a ringer.
Yeah, splitting water into hydrogen and oxygen should play a role in
No. Hydrogen, the hydrogen economy, right? You read a lot about hydrogen economy. Hydrogen splitting water, fine. It's been used for 2 purposes. One is to deflect people from real things that can happen now. Our former president, Bush, in 2003, if I remember, rolled out a hydrogen car as part of his State of the Union address for the express purpose of distracting people from increasing the corporate average fuel economy standards, right, which he didn't want. It was a very cynical move, and it worked. The second is that there are people who do believe that in the long term, you can use hydrogen in all sorts of ways, that you can now use electric power. And you should be planning for storing and transmitting hydrogen. There are some long-term reasons to think that you might be able to do it. We haven't yet found a catalyst that reduces greatly the energy that you need to split water. And we don't have a lot of excess energy in most parts of the world to do that. To do it directly with biological entities, engineered microbes, has been proposed. But the problem is, biology is really good at moving electrons around, but it does it really slowly. So you're going to need a vat the size of Saudi Arabia to do your biological processes in it, to do things at commercial scale. And that's a problem. So I'm not a big believer in the hydrogen economy. Are there going to be disruptive things like maybe fusion power? It's possible. The problem with fusion is, and I saw on the back page of the Gulf Times today, there was a physicist here talking about fusion this week. The problem is that when you fuse deuterium, you get a half an MeV gamma ray, and it's going to turn your stainless steel container radioactive. In 20 years, you're going to have this thing glowing in the dark. It's going to be a problem. I'm real skeptical. But, hey, it could happen. Not going to happen in my lifetime, but it could happen. Right. Yes, ma'am.
First of all, thank you for being here today. It was wonderful to hear you talking.
Thank Dean Bevars for inviting me.
Thank you. There is a lot of news about this algae as a possible source of energy.
Yep.
So, can you, what is its potential?
Okay, algae for vehicle power has been demonstrated, right? And people like Craig Ventnor and a few other things, Joule Biotech, are engineering microbes to do that. It's a lot more efficient than what we're just talking about, which is microbes to hydrogen. And so instead of a vat the size of Saudi Arabia, you just need a vat the size of about New Jersey to do that. They're really slow, and that's a problem. You can do it, and there's a big difference between the things that look really good on the cover of a magazine and the things that work at large scale. I'm pretty pessimistic about biofuels at large scale, but they do work in demonstration projects, absolutely. Thank you. There was one back here. Two back here. Yes, sir.
Yeah, back on the hydrogen, not the hydrogen economy, but taking water. I mean, that's the best storage unit right there, and the molecules storing energy. And if you use sunlight and a catalyst to break it into hydrogen and then burn that, you want to comment on that?
Sure. It's really good at storing it. It's really lousy at giving up. Breaking that bond is just energetically unfavored. It costs you a lot to break that bond. And we just haven't found any catalyst that helps enough. Yes, sir.
Thank you. There was a 60 Minutes article once about Bloom Energy, some ex-NASA guy too.
Yeah. Well,
and
they're really good at writing press releases.
Yeah, and so that was talking about democratization of the grid, which is basically creating that. So how does that come into picture in this? Because your last comment kind of alluded to some of that.
Well, let me not talk about Bloom Energy, which is a joke, and I would use language that's not suitable in public. But I will talk about something that is not a joke, and that is distributed energy. Natural gas prices, even at the prices in Europe, $8 an MCF, and certainly at the natural gas prices in the US, make it quite possible to generate heat and electricity in your own home, or by absorptive chilling, air conditioning electricity in your own home. And the situation is that in Europe, that kind of distributed generation has been favored by tax policy in the Netherlands. So we see a lot of combined heat and power, as it's called, run on natural gas in the Netherlands. In the United Kingdom, and I'm not talking about subsidy policies, I'm just permitting policies and some other things that make it much more difficult. In the UK, where they had cheap North Sea gas for a long time too, as in the Netherlands, that didn't take off. So the regulatory environment is very important. But yes, I think that there are some new technologies, Stirling cycle engines, for example, that make combined heat and power in the home or in areas the size of this one very favored. The trouble is, when you do that, you generate more heat or more absorptive chilling for air conditioning than you need electric power. And you often oversize the system for the electricity, and then you want to sell it back to the grid. And that's okay in some places, but you're not going to get as much for it as you have to pay, right? Because you're buying retail and you're selling wholesale. And so people get really head-scratching about that. But yes, I think that that's important.
So to follow up on that, you showed another slide where the Fourier transform for wind is that when you reach, say, a majority of 15 wind farms, but actually if you do it at 3 or 4, you get better. So can you democratize wind farms then? And
not so easily. People aren't stupid enough to live where it's windy, right? And the small wind turbines that people do put in their homes as kind of a fashion statement are very inefficient. You have to go up about 80 meters and have a 1.5 megawatt turbine to get any efficiency. Stay away from the small ones. They don't work very well, and they don't work very long either. So, yes, sir.
Dr. Abt, how environmentally friendly these batteries that would be used in the grid, please?
So the question is, how environmentally friendly are the batteries? You could, from a monetary standpoint, use lead-acid batteries now in the grid. They're cheap, but they're an environmental disaster because of both the lead and the sulfuric acid. The new batteries, the aqueous ion batteries, are essentially salt water for the electrolyte, and the electrodes are carbon charcoal and sodium. So they are fairly environmentally friendly. The ones that are being used now are largely sodium sulfur and not so environmentally friendly. but not awful like lead acid. We have time for one or two more? Yes, sir.
Don't you think what's happening on the shale gas stream in the U.S. might dramatically suppress the appetite to invest in renewables such as solar and wind?
Question was, isn't the shale gas boom going to suppress the appetite to invest in renewables such as solar and wind? Yes, in one way and no in another. Yes, because it's unlikely that in the austere physical environment we have now that Congress is going to renew the federal tax credit for producing wind power, currently about 2 cents a kilowatt hour. No, because the state renewable portfolio requirements, standards as we call them, obligations as they call them in England, are still in place. And people seem to have the stomach for them. Now, it requires both the federal production tax credit and the state obligation for a wind farm to make money. And so I think there's going to be some issues where people don't invest, and so the people who are under the obligation, namely the power companies, have to pay large penalties for not meeting the renewable portfolio standard. That's going to get very interesting. It's going to be a fun ride. So thank you all very much. Appreciate it.